Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. It's as simple as that. And on this episode, Joel Schumacher horror movies. We talk about the late filmmaker's impact on us and our feelings about him before we dive into his three horror movies The Lost Boys, Flatliners, and Blood Creek. There's a lot to talk about. Stick around right here on Movie Marathon Mood.
Please welcome Joel Schumacher, everybody. Joel Schumacher. Hello, Joel. How lovely to see you. I haven't seen
It's
you.
great to see you. We had our first date on the beach, I
We
believe.
did, that's
Yes.
right. We met at a mutual friend's house and we had a lovely time, didn't we?
Yes. Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
Hi, babe.
The hell? You know each other?
Oh, Jeff?
Yeah?
Don't say- Jeff?
Oh, hell yeah.
You
That was
know.
over at the beach house. We had a great
What
time.
happened in the steel factory stays in the steel factory.
The hell?
Hi, I'm Jesse Ghosttrap here, joined by my buddy, friend, Drew Cordell. Drew, how's it going?
Jesse, doing well. Pleasure as always, my friend.
Here is the first of, I imagine, many episodes that we'll do for the month of October, and that can only mean one thing: horror. And I got to say that for many years now, every October I watch a whole bunch of horror movies. And since we have a show called Movie Marathon Mood, it only makes sense that some of that, a fraction of that, could at least be related to the show. It would be kind of a crime if it didn't.
Right.
October is just such a great month. And it's not even just horror. I had to go on a slight tangent here, so follow with me. But a mutual former manager of both of ours one time said that horror was my favorite genre. And I realized something. I realized he only said that because he didn't like horror. And he noticed that I watched a lot of it, especially in October. Because I have another friend that says, "Oh, your favorite thing is superhero movies," and I said, "No, it's not. Superhero movies aren't my favorite." And I realized he said that just because he doesn't like superhero movies. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Right.
The truth is, I don't have a favorite genre, period. And I feel like a lot of times when people say that they don't like an entire genre, it's because of their own biases.
Right.
And they probably would find something they like in that genre if they only would bother to dig into it. Say la vie. Every October, though, I try to figure out which horror movies I'm going to watch. Often I don't know which ones I'm going to watch,
Yeah.
but say the year that Wes Craven died, that kind of made the decision for me. I was going to watch everything Wes Craven. So I did. Watched everything. I even watched some of his TV movies.
Oh, wow.
Like I dug in deep. The only one I didn't watch was the Music of the Heart movie of Meryl Streep. Didn't watch that one. But I did watch everything else because talk about a guy dedicated to his genre, Wes Craven.
Oh, yeah.
He could have made so many other types of things. This is a whole thread that I'm trying not to go too deep on right now. The point is, I think Wes Craven is an underrated filmmaker that didn't really get his due in life. He could have made so many inventive, wonderful things. But yeah, this year it didn't make up my entire October nearly in the same breadth that Wes Craven did. But we lost a filmmaker that, speaking of underrated, I really like this guy, and I swear to God, I think you know this, Drew. I would have said this before he passed away. Sometimes people like to say things when somebody dies.
Right.
I have said this for years. I love Joel Schumacher.
Yeah.
I've maintained that position. I'm pretty sure we've had conversations in the past about him as a filmmaker. And make absolutely no mistake, I hate Batman and Robin too. I also hate Batman and Robin. That's one of my least favorite movies ever.
Yeah. And to clear things up, even though it is a horror to watch, we're not going to review Batman and Robin.
See, that's fair.
Just, just to kind of ease everyone's tensions a little bit, or at least not right now. So it's not going to get that scary.
I have plans to watch it at some point. We could watch the DC and Marvel movies. That's a future tangent we'll take off on. But yeah, not for this episode.
Right.
And the thing is, when it comes to genres that he went into, I feel like he's probably, if you had to marry him to one genre, he probably did more thrillers than just about anything. And thriller is like a cousin of horror movies.
Def-
But he only made three horror movies, three outright horror movies. Um, two of the ones in this episode are more definitively horror than the middle one, and I say that uh, the middle one is still very much horror. It's just also a thriller.
right.
So that's the weird debate that people could have about horror movies versus thrillers. But I don't think anybody's going to argue about these movies being horror movies. They could bring up Phantom of the Opera, however, which is horror tangent. It's a tangentially horror. It's a more gothic romance than it is horror, but it benefits from Joe Schumacher understanding the horror genre
Right.
and being able to dive into that visually. But again, not something we're going to talk about on this episode. But I think nonetheless worth bringing up in terms of all that Joe Schumacher could offer as a filmmaker.
He's made some incredible movies, not just well made, but that, that stand the test of time. And I think particularly fondly of Falling Down with Michael Douglas, which is
Yeah.
one of the great. I think it's better to watch it now in this age that we are currently living in, the age of madness, if you will. The last 4 5 years have been pretty crazy in America and all over the world, and particularly this year. I've watched Falling Down during this pandemic, and the breakdown of that character is very similar to the climate that we live in right now. And I think Schumacher had his finger on the pulse of things, and that it's an older film, um, but I believe he has shown that through the years, and I'll defend Batman forever until I die. I enjoy that movie. I don't care that people hate it as fervently as they hate Batman and Robin. There is a huge difference of quality between the two of them. He's just made so many different kinds of movies. It's hard to but they still are distinctly his style too, which is really cool. You can look at one that we're definitely going to watch tonight. Well, two, because I haven't seen Blood Creek, so I can't speak for the style of it yet. But Flatliners and Lost Boys, you can definitely look and go, okay, I can tell this was a Schumacher movie. Then you can go watch something like you know Time to Kill or Falling Down, something like that. Go, yeah, I see the thread. I see his style here. That's just kind of a compliment to him as a filmmaker, just that he's was able to adapt to different kinds of genres and run with them and put his own voice into them. I appreciate genre filmmakers like, as we mentioned earlier, Wes Craven. Who are talented and focused on what they love. And make a bunch of movies that follow certain pattern. But I also really appreciate people like Schumacher who are just great filmmakers in general and can really do just about any kind of film. And you're absolutely spot on with him being underrated. He's a very wasn't a very adequate filmmaker, to put it very lightly. He had some great flourishes. I loved kind of little nuances in the camera work in his movies. They're just cool tricks, editing, just things that cohesive things through his work that really stand out. And no, I don't know if he would be in that elusive top 10 list of directors, but he wouldn't be far from my top 25, top 30 directors. I don't think that's far out of the question. He has a good body of work, and I'm kind of chomping at the bit to watch these films that we have selected for this month.
Yeah, I think talking about tricks of his, phone booth is a huge example of that, where you have a film that's set in this very tight space, sometimes literally just in the phone booth,
Right.
also around a city block, and very tightly focused, and you never feel bored. You never feel like the shot's repeated. It's exciting the entire time, and that's a skilled director that can pull that off. And a movie like Tigerland that he also did with Colin Farrell, that movie has a look that, in a way, isn't as flourished in style in the same way that some of his other movies are, and yet I think you can still see him in it. He was able to adapt and flow with different types of movies, but still very much influence them. And that's somebody that has a voice as a director. If you have a voice as a director, you actually can truly tell a story. And I think he wasn't just a stylist; he actually told stories through his own eyes. But moving specifically to this episode, that is our October horror episode, we're starting off with a movie that I've seen about as much as any other movie that I've ever seen. It's definitely up there in terms of most viewed movies for me, The Lost Boys. And the movie, like, it's weird because I don't know why I keep bringing up Wes Craven, but I think about Scream and how plenty of times I said in the past, that movie is one of my favorite movies. And then I would go a little while without having seen it. And my brain would switch and say, it's just silly. It's fluff. It's maybe fun, but how can it really be a great movie? And then I would watch it again and I'd be like, oh, yeah, no, it's a great movie.
Right.
And I would forget every so often. And now I've realized I've I haven't done that in a while. I've been able to move past any pretense in my own head and say that I love the movie Scream. And I feel like the same thing kind of applies to The Lost Boys, because I would go so far as to call it pop art. I just think it's one of those great movies that can be wild and entertaining and silly and have absurd touches in places, but everything about it is part and parcel to the experience. And I just think it works, and it works on so many levels. It's fun, but it's also got different age groups that it focuses on at different points. It moves and flows, sometimes with different, levels of humor or different levels of thrills and horror. I can't wait to watch it again because I really find it to be such an exciting movie.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. It's one that I've seen quite a bit, and I also kind of have a similar vibe with it. That when I do watch it, I don't necessarily dismiss it, but I think, oh, it's the Lost Boys, and then I finish it and I'm like, man, the Lost Boys is a great movie, and it's been another run of years since the last time I actually sat down and watched it. But it has a killer vibe to it. I think from the look, and the style of it to the soundtrack. It has one of those signature '80s soundtracks uh, that I would put in the same breath as Top Gun or you know another Schumacher film, St. Elmo's Fire, some something where the film was essentially selling the soundtrack because it just had so many good songs that you associate with that movie. And uh, I put Lost Boys in that category because there's just some great music on here, but it just fits the atmosphere the movie's going for, which is just kind of like a punk gothic, feel like not goth in the girl that went to your high school and loves the crow goth, but the actual gothic, uh, you know, gothic feel. And I love the crow, by the way. That's not a slap to the crow, but just trying to clear up my wording here. But it's just kind of like a loving marriage of kind of like a gothic vampire story, but with a very kind of vibrant punk atmosphere and clashing together to make. I think pop art is a very fitting way to describe it. When you think of this movie, I think the picture is very clear, or at least it is in my head. I picture Keith Sutherland's face and his kind of spiked hair and mullet and his his whole get up and the soundtrack, some of the songs like a Cry Little Sister immediately pop in my head, and just the whole feel of the movie kind of comes to me, and that's still kind of be like, oh yeah, the Lost Boys is gonna, and then it's not until I watch it and have that vibe flow through me watching it that it hits me that, oh, it's a great movie again. And I think that's a gift that keeps on giving because it is, you're dead on 100%. It's one of those movies that you experience it. It is just a complete experience, and part of the thrill of it is in watching it. And I think it has staying power. I don't think it's a forgettable movie at all. Uh, but the some of the things that even if you do remember it, when it all comes together as the experience, you're watching it. That's when it's at its most powerful. That's it's a real accomplishment that not a lot of filmmakers can make movies like that, and it speaks volumes of Schumacher, even if that was the only film he was able to do that with. But it's not. This is just a horror movie he was able to do that with. And I think that's pretty telling of the talent we're talking about.
Well, the other interesting thing about this trio is that you end up, I mean, Lost Boys and Flatliners aren't that far apart. They're just 3 years apart, but they feel almost worlds apart. And like these three movies all come from what I would call almost different eras for Schumacher. They're all from different decades, all three of them, but they also speak to some of the ebb and flow of his career, at least a little bit. Because Lost Boys is pretty early on. It's pretty hot at the time, but Flatliners is when his stock had risen pretty high. And it's not like every one of his movies was a smash hit, but he was a big star right there in that time frame. And he was a director that got to make Batman eventually,
Right.
but he was also making pretty regular, bigger movies in the system. And and this is something that'll come up again on Blood Creek too. He has some fantastic casts. Whenever I play the Bacon number game,
Right. Right.
I often go to Flatliners because holy crap, you got quite a loaded cast
Yeah.
that you can just kind of point to, and they're in a lot of other things with a lot of other people. So Flatliners is kind of my go-to. Can I connect that person to somebody else that's in Flatliners?
Right.
That's usually one of my numbers. And it's pretty easy. I mean, that's the whole reason the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon exists, is because he's been in a lot of movies with a lot of people.
Right.
It's often pretty easy to do. But Flatliners is a pretty big one. And I think you said you've only seen it once or a small number of times at the very least.
Yeah,
And I've seen it a number of times myself.
I remember seeing it probably about 12 years ago. Um, maybe a little sooner than that. I remember the film. I remember the premise, and again the kind of vibe. I'm a huge fan of Keith Sutherland, so I'm all there for that. But like you said, just incredible. You got Julia Roberts, um, Oliver Platt, William Baldwin, being, and of course Kevin Bacon. So just going off that alone, like the talent that he was able to bring with him uh, into these films speaks volumes. But like, I can't wait to see it again because I don't particularly remember everything about it very well. And usually, like, I remember because, you know, for those that haven't ever seen it, the premise is them kind of allowing themselves to be clinically dead, and hence the title, and see if uh, there's something on the other side of life. And it gets pretty hairy for them in some of their experiences. And I particularly remember William Baldwin's characters, ones for whatever reason. Uh, but I just remember it having a really great atmosphere to it, and like you said, it really kind of follows the thriller angle a lot more than horror, but the horror and supernatural elements are definitely at the heart of it. So it is a horror film for sure, but I can't wait to watch it again, and it'll be like watching it for the first time for me because I've forgotten, uh, some of the key plot points here, and I really can't. It's not going to be too much familiar territory in this for me outside of Lost Boys. This is going to be a refresher, and Blood Creek, of course, is going to be brand new because I have not seen it, but I'm definitely excited to watch Flatliners again.
I've always really had a soft spot for Flatliners and have no interest in watching the remake that just came
Oh
out
no,
a few years ago. Like, it just looks like hot garbage, and maybe I'm mistaken, and maybe I should give it a chance. I'm not gonna rate it because I haven't seen it, but a large part of not wanting to see it is because the first one is so distinct,
right,
and the new one didn't look like it had a particular take. It didn't look like it doesn't have to look like the original. It just needs to look like it has its own vision of what it wants to do. And instead, it just looks like, we're gonna blandly modernize it and put some
right,
current little stars in here. And it's not nearly the same type of thing. But again, I know you haven't seen Blood Creek at all. I have seen it. I've only seen it once, and it was years ago, so I don't remember it thoroughly. And it's obviously a very divisive kind of movie. It doesn't have like rave reviews or anything. I would venture to guess that most people have not seen Blood Creek. It's really slipped through, the cracks, and really speaks to some degree, at least, of Schumacher's latter day career, where he didn't exactly have the same spotlight that he once had. A lot of his movies are smaller in stature, and at the same time, he always managed to continue to work with a lot of crazy cool people. And if you look at the cast of Blood Creek, it's Henry Cavill and Dominique Purcell, Michael Fassbender,
Right.
and these people, in particular Henry Cavill and Michael Fassbender, before their own stars had really shot through the roof.
Right.
And he worked with these people right in that time. Schumacher had a knack for spotting talent like that, and that's interesting in and of itself. Blood Creek is a weird, wild movie, and I can't wait to watch it again and to talk about it with you. I think it's going to be a fun time.
I agree. And, just kind of knowing a little bit about it, I don't know too much, but I do know it has a little bit to do with uh, a certain group of former fascists that tried to conquer the world at one point. So anytime you can kind of mix them into a horror story, I'm kind of there because they're one of the ultimate horrors of reality that humanity can get as ugly as the Third Reich. Anytime you throw any kind of supernatural horror element to that, I enjoy it. I'm not really a huge Call of Duty guy, but I play Nazi zombies. I I don't know why, but I'll play it. I enjoy things like that. Um, so at the very least, I'll be interested to see it. It's interesting to note this came out the same year that Glorious Bastards came out, and Fassbender would his star would really start to shine that year, or he would start to really pop on people's radars. So we're gonna have a 6 degrees of the Third Reich here with these movies, but I think that's kind of a cool connection of Fassbender having these kind of two completely different kind of World War II themed in a way, or at least Nazi themed films. So I'm really interested to see this movie just because of the cast and just to see what Schumacher did with this kind of idea, and I'm I'm always up for something different.
And I'm still surprised that a guy named Fassbender was connected to movies involving Nazis.
Yeah,
But anyway, I think it's worth pointing out that neither one of us would consider the trio that we have before us as definitive Schumacher movies. This isn't meant to be here's what Schumacher is
right.
in total, but at the same time, I think it's an interesting trio. Lost Boys is definitely high up on the list in terms of movies people talk about when they talk about Schumacher. And at the same time, I'm just excited to watch these three movies to get things kicked off for horror of 2020, so to speak. There's a lot that's horrible about 2020, but horror movies in an entertaining way for 2020. So we're gonna start things off with the Lost Boys. Drew, I'll see you on the other side, my friend.
All right, fare thee well. See you on the other side.
Michael and Sam have just moved to Santa Carla, California. They're about to discover its secret.
Notice anything unusual about Santa Carla yet?
No. It's a pretty cool place. If you're a Martian.
Or a vampire?
You're a vampire, Michael. My own brother, a damn blood-sucking vampire.
Oh, you wait till Mom finds out, buddy. When a vampire bites it, it's never a pretty sight.
Michael, they're coming! Oh, shit!
And here we are on the other side of watching three Schumacher horror films. and we start things off right away with the Lost Boys, which right out of the gate, of course, is the one that both of us have seen the most. It's the one that's surrounded by the most iconography. I'm kind of amazed that, in spite of the fact that obviously I love the film, it's still almost surprising to see how many ways Lost Boys keeps popping up in popular culture. Like it keeps kind of popping up here and there referentially. And part of that's because, people that grew up with it, like we did in some measure, they are also of age and making art themselves.
Right.
So that's at least a part of it. I don't know that it will always happen, but it's still fascinating how much The Lost Boys has been this kind of touchstone film for many people. And on one hand, it's just a super cool and super fun movie. It's very funny. It's a comedy at plenty of turns, just as much as it's also very horror at other turns. One of my favorite things about The Lost Boys, and this also speaks to what I brought up before in our introduction about this kind of cross generational aspect to the story, is like something that happens to all the characters, a lot of the characters at some point, something that happens really early on whenever they're going to Grandpa's house. They're walking up, and Grandpa's playing dead.
Yes.
And to him, it's this hilarious gag, this great little thing. And when he's like, "Ha ha, I gotcha," like he's entirely in his own world. He might be enjoying the reefer, but regardless of which, like he's entirely in his own headspace, and he's proud of this moment. He's had his laugh, and absolutely nobody else was fooled for a moment. His daughter, the matriarch of the family, she walks up and checks on him, just to be responsible. But she's not really concerned. You can see it in her, like she's like
Right.
basically a step away from just sighing immediately. Be like, there he is, Ed. Wish he wouldn't. And the kids just aren't having it at all. They're just like
Right.
passively accepting it. But it's not just that moment, obviously, that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that the movie is playful, but it also establishes that its characters are not perfect. They're struggling at times. The Frog Brothers aren't nearly as aware of things as they think they are. A lot of the characters are so much in their own headspace, but they aren't really as in control of things as they think they are. So that adds to the humor of the movie, but it also adds some to the tension as well because these characters are so out of their league, you know? I think that's one of the things that makes the movie what it is and part of what makes it so special. I absolutely love and adore the sequence when they go in the cave and they're ready to take down these vampires,
Right.
and they're not in the least bit prepared for what they're going to see
No.
at any point. I'm like, well, of course, yeah, that's this is their coffin. They're of course they're hanging upside down in the ceiling, they're up there in the cave. That's what they are. And meanwhile, they're thinking, bump 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 bump. Like there's no way they're not terrified at the same time, but they're so cocky and self assured, and they have to put up that front to be like, yeah, well, we got the stakes, and we're just gonna climb up there now, and we'll get them. We'll get them. They're vulnerable.
Right.
And the second they get one, and they do actually kill a vampire, but obviously it's immediately a huge, dangerous mess at the same time. I just find that aspect of the movie really appealing. Uh, and again, it also to me speaks to the cross generational nature of the story, which is not something that was present in the original script either. That's something that Joe Schumacher himself helped bring to the story because he thought that the character should be aged up. I mean, when you hear the title, the first thing you probably a lot of people would probably think of is Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, and you would think younger. And this was originally supposed to be a Richard Donner movie, with the script by Jan Fisher, James Jeremias. Their script had Goonies aged children, younger characters, and I don't know what that movie looks like.
Right.
I can't really imagine that vampire movie with all Goonies aged kids. I really would love to almost see that world, that alternate reality where Richard Donner made this vampire movie of the Lost Boys. But I'm also incredibly grateful that we got Joe Schumacher involved instead and got Jeffrey Boehm to rewrite on the script and make it into what it is with some younger kids and also the older ones. And that makes the movie a lot of what it is, you know. Jeffrey Boehm, of course, he one of the things that he wrote was the Dead Zone, which I really enjoy that film. Inner Space is a terrific movie that doesn't always get its due.
It's fantastic.
He wrote on Lethal Weapon. He wrote Lethal Weapon 2.
Yes.
Yeah. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And this guy is, I think, undoubtedly, along with Joe Schumacher and his influence, what makes The Lost Boys what it is. I mean, and like I said, a huge part of that is Joe Schumacher himself and his vision and his idea. And a big part of it, what he wanted to do, he's like, he wants to like make it sexier. He thought it should be a sexier movie with older characters. But I also enjoy the way that it isn't sexy at times too. And the characters very much again like out of their league. Like Jason Patrick is a terrific essentially main character. Like I think it's easy to say that he's the main hero of the story,
Right.
even though there were plenty of other turns that were with Corey Haim. Jason Patrick is a good hero. One of my favorite little things in this movie is when he suddenly starts flying and he can't control it, and he grabs onto the phone cord to possibly hold him in, which also helps him talk his mom down.
Right.
Whenever his mom is possibly freaking out, and he just so happens, oh hey, I have the phone here, so I can uh, say, no, I'm fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine here, mom. While I'm flying outside the window. Then he convinces his brother to let him in, even though his brother's freaking out, obviously, too, for good reason. And then when he does let him in, it's this great moment, but at the same time, he kind of seems to stop flying. And in a way, it might seem like I'm nitpicking the moment a little bit, but I'm not exactly really nitpicking. I'm not even saying it's a terrible thing. Not really. Like I actually think that's a terrific moment and speaks to the beauty in the way that the story is told. Like it's fast paced, it's funny, it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it also takes itself just seriously enough that it has an edge to it. Because that sequence when Michael is seduced into becoming a vampire is one of the best stretches of the whole film.
Yeah.
And it's played deadly seriously. And it's fantastic. And it's terrifying. There's so much that happens there, like hanging on to the bottom of these train tracks.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying moment. That edginess is something that's definitely present in the story, while at the same time, so much of it is also hilarious. I also am reminded at times of oddly enough, E.T. because of the family nature of the story, you know,
Right.
and the household that's a product of divorce, but we don't really talk about dad that much. It's just this kind of hanging thread.
Right.
And by no means is the divorce as ingrained in the Lost Boys as much as it is in E.T. ET is basically about that, and you notice that more when you are an adult.
Right.
uh, the kind of deeper nature of the story. The Lost Boys is more fanciful about it, but I don't think it's a mistake that that is in there too, where there's something about it, about that part of the story, and Diane Wiest, who's utterly fantastic,
Yeah.
and seeing her, especially right at the end, when she suddenly is part of the vampire story and not just on her own
Right.
part of the story, unawares of the real dangers, the supernatural danger that surrounds her. When she realizes that she's actually been Edward Herman, basically trying to lure her into this fold to be the mother of the Lost Boys. It's this kind of wonderful moment of betrayal, I feel like, but also a moment of her kind of realizing what's been happening to her sons all the time too. Like it brings the family together. It's I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself, but a lot of these, all these movies that we're watching tonight showcase, in some degree, Schumacher's optimism as well as the edgy darkness that lies in there as well.
Right.
He clearly likes to delve into the darkness. I feel like he's echoing that from perhaps his own experiences as well, bringing that sort of edginess into the world. But at the same time, I feel like he was such uh, a realistic optimist, basically. And I think that's one of the reasons that I respond to his work so often as I do, is because he's realistic enough to deal with the darkness and not ignore the darkness that exists in our reality, while at the same time having this hopeful spirit and bringing people together at the same time.
Right.
Uh, I feel like that's a really compelling, interesting aspect of his work and the Lost Boys in its own way too. There's so much that I could say about the Lost Boys. I'm gonna turn it over to you before I just get too carried away talking about so many aspects.
I mean, to me, and obviously, I'm going to go into, you know, some of the same things that you've talked about and what makes it good. But for me, just the atmosphere of this movie begins and ends with the music. Um, and I mean that in the best way possible. We talked about before we watched it that, this is an experience as much as it is a film, and that vibe on it as soon as it starts. Cry Little Sister is just a incredibly cool atmosphere setter for you to just jump right into this film. And there's so many good songs in this. It just really creates that, kind of that young, edgy, I guess you could say sexy vibe that they were going for. And maybe we can blame the Lost Boys for sexing up vampires. I mean, I think there's always been a sexual nature of vampire stories. And Anne Rice was writing, Interview with the Vampire long before Lost Boys, but in terms of just like film and like what it would eventually lead to Twilight, like maybe we can blame the Lost Boys for that, but I don't want to because I really enjoy the vibe of this movie, and it's just cool, and I don't care. Like some people might go, "Oh, it's so '80s." Well, I don't care. Like the fact that it's '80s has nothing to do with it. I can't argue that it is very '80s, but I don't think about that when I'm watching it. I'm very much caught up in the movie, and I love kind of the clash of styles and some of the characters. Of course, David and the gang are very macho, um, except for Alex Winter. But and of course he would be the one they kill. But that's just that's just hilarious. But I like their look. I like Michael. I think Jason Patrick's really great in this movie. I think he's kind of an underrated, very underrated actor anyway. He's been in some good stuff. He's been in some not so good stuff. Speed too, but he's really good in this, and I think family is a big part of this movie. And like you mentioned, the brothers, you can tell. I think he and Corey Haim both really sell their brotherhood, and that's what really kind of keeps this movie. The serious parts of this movie stick is their, love for each other, and also, their mom too. You can tell they care about each other, and that this isn't just a oh no, my brother's a vampire type thing. There's actually emotional depth to it, but it never takes it too far down the serious route where it's hopeless. There's a lot of fun. This is one of the most fun movies. This is one of the most enjoyable movies I've ever seen. It's a crowd pleaser, but it's also a horror film, and that's actually, you know, the only movie I can think of that is more because this is. I mean, at the end of the day, I consider Lost Boys a horror film. That's it's October. That's why we're talking about it. I wouldn't, the only movie that I would consider maybe that's just a little bit better at the mix of humor and horror than this is American Werewolf in London, which is just one of the absolute best movies ever. So the only, there aren't very many movies that can really capture. In the '80s, there were a lot of they were that was kind of a thing that they were always going for, or were a lot were trying to mix in a decent amount of humor with the horror. And American Werewolf did it. The Howling did it. Gremlins did it, and I love all of these movies for different reasons. But I think kind of at the top is American Werewolf and the Lost Boys, and they're two completely different kinds of movies. Not trying to compare them as they are going for the same exact thing. They're going for completely different vibes, and I think American Werewolf completely succeeds at what it's trying to do, and Lost Boys completely succeeds in what it's doing. And it has a great blend of those crowd pleasing moments that I feel like would be the MCU crowd clapping moments we would get now. But specifically when Grandpa crashes through the cabin and hits Max with the post problem with Santa Carlos, all the damn vampires. That's just a great line. It's a great way to end the movie too. That he was the twist that he knew about it all along. It's one of the funniest things about the movie to me is Grandpa, like just you know, he's been kind of aloof the whole time, and like you mentioned, he's laying there pretending to be dead. Nobody either know, nobody thinks he's doing it or seems to care. Like it's he's a hilarious character, and he very much fits in with this. And nothing really kind of sticks out. I like And I said family is a big theme in this, and I like David and his group, and Keith Sutherland is awesome. And I'm gonna say this about Flatliners too, but I he doesn't necessarily have too much to say in this movie. But regardless of that, this is the when I think Keith Sutherland, if I don't think Jack Bauer first, I think Lost Boys because of the look and feel of this movie. He very much fits and eats up the scenery and stills every scene he's in. And that's still, with Jason Patrick being awesome in this too. But Keith Sutherland as David is great. But going back to the family theme, these brothers and sister, they're they're all family, and Max, of course, is revealed to be the real leader. The Frog Brothers, of course, another family, but I'm not going to treat them as too central to that theme as Michael and Sam and the actual Lost Boys. I I really like that dynamic and that they were trying to get Michael to join them and that trying to eventually get Sam too and get them all to join the family. I like that idea. I like the way it was executed. And Jeffrey Bohm, we've already name dropped some of his other work. I think he's really good at that family or friendship dynamic, and it shows in this movie. Schumacher runs away with it too. It oozes style. It has strong emotional ties to it. It has so much atmosphere to it. It's a great looking movie to me. It's very distinct. It's a blast. It's entertaining from beginning to end. There is not one moment in that movie that is boring. There is not one moment in it that's really kind of trivial. It's just one of the most fun movies there is, and I've seen it. I don't know how many times I have seen it.
You know what it is?
What's that?
It's an A plus.
Oh, yeah. I can't argue that. I give it that too. This is it's great, and there's no denying that. So yeah, I give it an A plus. On each viewing, it's just as good, if not better, than the last time you've seen it. And I think that's you can't ask for any better than that. It's just one of those kinds of films. And I I kind of when you were talking about the possibility of younger kids being in this kind of story, uh, like the Richard Donner version. That's probably the 1987 season we're going to get of Stranger Things, and we'll get to see Dustin accidentally kill a vampire, which will be hilarious. I'm kind of joking. I also wouldn't be surprised. But it is interesting to think of a more Goonies esque version of the Lost Boys. And, even though it might be a good thing, I think Richard Donner's great. You talked about Lethal Weapon, because Bone worked on Lethal Weapon 2 and 3.
Yeah.
But 2, Lethal Weapon 2 and the first one are great films. Richard Donner is a really good director, and I could see him doing a good story with this, but I wouldn't want to trade that for what this is. I love the kind of more edgy aspects of this movie, and yeah, A plus all the way. It's great. Still, after all this time, it hasn't aged a bit, fittingly enough.
The star of this movie though too, as amazing as so much of the main cast might be, including Jason Patrick and Kiefer, is just unreal, compelling, and magnetic. The star, though, is Timmy Capello.
Yes.
I just don't think we could possibly talk about the Lost Boys without mentioning our lead saxophone player. And one of my favorite things about seeing him recently in the Gunship Dark All Day video is like when you see the animation in the first part of the video
Yeah.
and you see this impossibly ripped saxophone player and you're like, well, that's complete caricature. That's completely absurd. But if you know the guy, then you already know, no, that's really him.
Right.
And then, of course, it cuts to live action at the end. And it's like the animation doesn't do him justice.
No, he still got it.
Props, though. Props to the saxophone.
That scene is one of the funniest and coolest. I mean, it really really speaks to this movie because it's hilarious that this muscular dude is shirtless playing a saxophone, but at the same time, the way he pulls it off, and it's a cool scene with Michael kind of becoming infatuated with Star, who we haven't even really talked about. Jamie Gertz, I like their chemistry in this.
Oh, she's good.
I like their scenes together. Um, I really enjoy kind of their love scene, and just their like. We just talk about how cool the hangout is, like the hotel on the cliff.
The production design in this movie is all
Yeah, I I completely agree with you about seduction of Michael is well done. They're hanging out in the lair and like eating Chinese food and like Michael's eating noodles and David says something about worms. He looks and sees worms or maggots. Those are really kind of standout moment and played straight too. I think that those things really do pay off. It, like the fun, the duel, the if you want to call it that, the fight between Michael and David at the end is really cool, and I like how it's built up too. And like you said, all the characters, the Frog Brothers are so stupid, and I love them for that. Like they're just idiots. Like and that's the point of them. That's what they're supposed to be. And like Corey Feldman is hilarious in this because he takes himself so seriously, or the character does. Jameson Newlander, they they think they know everything, and every time they kill a vampire, it's a complete surprise to them. Like when they kill Alex Winter, of course, but like even when they're doing like the whole holy water guns and the garlic and everything else and the steaks, just in that invasion kind of part at the end, it with the vamps like vamp out and die. Like when they get the guy in the bathtub, it's hilarious. Like their reactions, and so like them all kind of being fish out of water. With this, it really does add an element to it that if they were Blade and were professional vampire killers, do it every day, it wouldn't be the same movie. And I don't do that to this Blade because God knows I enjoy Blade and Blade 2, but it's completely different movies. I'm glad the Frog Brothers are idiots and completely out of their depth um, because it really fits the tone of this movie. And like, I think that movies like this that do have kind of a serious horror side and a humor, you can risk your tone. You can risk, not being true to the story you're trying to tell and kind of going all over the place. This is completely balanced. Whenever it needs to be serious, it's serious. Whenever it can indulge in the humor, it does. And it never goes too far one way or the other. And it's a perfect balance. And like I said, the only other movie I can think of that does that just as good, if not better, is American Werewolf. And in London, not Paris, just in case anyone's wondering. That's good company to be in. There aren't very many movies like Lost Boys either that kind of have that distinct vibe. It's kind of one of it's kind of one in a million, It's we really haven't seen anything like it before it, and like after it, nothing really successfully imitated it, and it's a classic. There's not much more to say about it. It's a classic.
We talked about how sleek and stylish the movie is too. And Joe Schumacher was a fashion guy before he was a film director. So obviously that sleekness is kind of innate in him to some measure. But it's also worth mentioning the cinematographer of The Lost Boys, Michael Chapman, who also shot Taxi Driver
Yes,
and Raging Bull. Like,
yes,
holy cow. And the 78 Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Those are some of my favorite movies. Incredibly gorgeous, incredibly well shot movies. The Lost Boys was shot in 3 weeks
right,
production. So it was very tight. And I think you can sense that to some degree, especially if you're thinking about that while you're watching it. It's not the biggest production in many ways, but what it does so cleverly and so well and so sleekly that it works. And it's a blast and it's a great movie.
right.
So this was 87. It really helped cement Joe Schumacher as a bigger director, because it was a decent hit, and has its fan base. Before he made Lost Boys, he also made Sound Almost Fire, which is the reason you have that picture poster of Rob Lowe on Corey Haim's closet door. Schumacher's paying homage to one of the stars of St. Elmo's Fire. But 3 years after Lost Boys, you get Flatliners.
Flatline.
30 seconds to go.
Can you recall any specific emotion or sensation?
No, but there is something out there.
We're running out of time.
300, clear. Nothing. Your heart, go again. Clear. Nothing, I can't hear anything. Come on, Nelson. Breathe. We lost him. No! Welcome back, man.
I'm going next.
2 minutes.
2:10.
Was there anything negative about your experience? This is too weird. We've experienced death. Now, somehow we brought our sins back physically.
That is not hallucination, and it is not possible.
Oh my God.
You withheld information. That's the same as lying.
You wouldn't have done it. At least we would have had a choice. You're not real. Hey, come on, they're your sins. Live with them. I do. No! Nelson, please! I thought I paid my dues.
Thank you for the nightmare.
No! Come on, Joe! Starting CPR. 1,000. 2,000.
Flatliners.
So we're jumping to a new decade, but it's only 3 years later. And at the same time, it's so wild that you have this movie as Schumacher is essentially at a peak of his kind of influence in the Hollywood system in some ways, at least.
Right.
To a certain degree, he made even bigger movies after, but he was definitely high up on the star meter to some degree. And right there with him, the stars of this movie are unreal and were coming off of their own fame at the time too. Like they were hot stars, and Schumacher remarkable throughout his career in having talent around him, and many times he discovered talent. And we mentioned in the introduction, like Colin Farrell, I believe, like one of the people that he discovered in like Tigerland,
Yes.
and Lost Boys has plenty of examples. St. Elmo's Fire has others. Look at the cast in Flatliners. Obviously, you bring Kiefer back into the mix. You have Julia Roberts, who is right there in a peak of her own fame, coming off of Pretty Woman, or the same year as Pretty Woman. Like
Right.
she's right there in this moment. Kevin Bacon, Mr. Footloose himself. These are huge stars. William Baldwin was a big deal in this time frame. It's just crazy to see these big stars. I really love Oliver Platt. I'm hate to bring him up in concert with the idea of superstardom, because I'm not trying to denigrate him, but I will bring that up right from the start, which is to say that one of my favorite moments in Flatliners is towards the end, or as we're getting into like the final act,
Right.
and they're all out there in the street, and uh, Oliver Platt at one point, like they're all kind of arguing about the depth of the problem that they're in, kind of being surrounded and haunted by characters from their past,
Yes.
or as they put it, like their sins coming back in some measure, like things that haunt them at the very least from their past. And Kiefer having held back information, which is pretty crap thing that he does, and not divulging the full experience that he had going under. But meanwhile, Oliver Platt's the one dude in this group that doesn't flatline, that doesn't have the near death experience. And he says, I knew this was a bad deal right from the start.
Right.
I knew there was something bad with this. And everybody pretty much looks at him and like kills him with their eyes, and just tells him to shove it.
Yeah.
It's such a fun little moment, and a kind of tacit acknowledgement of Oliver Platt's place in this story. I love that he's in this movie. I think he's a terrific actor, but I love as well that you have the one dude who doesn't go under. That's
Right.
part of the group. And that's as much as we acknowledge it, really. Is that one little moment. At the same time, I do kind of wonder, like, I almost hope that he has the darkest secrets of all of them. That would have been a great reveal at the end. It's like, oh, by the way, it's good I didn't go under because I actually have a really dark past. And that's your third act. It's like, surprise.
He's Billy Mahoney's brother.
Oh, there you go. I really enjoyed this movie. I saw it when I was, I believe, a teenager. Back in when it was on VHS. Got put in the VCR one day, watched it, and I've seen it a number of times. Honestly, um, not as many as The Lost Boys, but I have seen it a number of times. It's one that, for whatever reason, I keep coming back to, and I'm sure a big part of that is the reason we have this grouping to begin with is Joel Schumacher.
Right.
I feel like a huge part of that is what he brings to the table. He really adds this sleek, stylish flavor to the movie, but also, like, not to beat a dead horse, but speaking of the next movie, but we have this kind of hopefulness that underlies it as well. Ultimately, it's something that I find interesting in this story. Is on one hand, it has this spiritual aspect, which is part of the supernatural aspect of the story. Like, is there something beyond death? And you have the one character, Kevin Bacon, it's the atheist who says, "Oh, there's nothing." And the movie's far from being like a religious film,
Right.
but at the same time, it has this other side of it too, which is like they're surrounded by angels and have this protection from the beyond to a certain degree as well.
Right.
And as dangerous as their situation becomes, there's also this aspiration toward something better in a way too, that they could resolve their issues. What do you think about Flatliners, Drew?
Well, Like I think I had only seen this one time, and I think I saw it with you when we roomed together.
Possibly.
If I didn't see it with you, I watched it in the apartment, maybe by myself. I don't know, but either way, it's been a minute since I saw it.
It easily could have been one of my horror movies one
Yeah, could have been. And it's really good. It's a little bit better than I remember it being. Of course, Keither is just awesome in this. And, he's just again he every time or these two times that he's in a Schumacher film, because I'm not going to say his character in Time to Kill is cool when he's a clan member,
What a cool guy.
but mullet and all. But anyway, back to this. He's just kind of hanging out. Has a really cool line right off the bat, like today's a good day to die. And just you immediately know you're in for an interesting ride. And the vibe of this movie is incredible. Of course, Schumacher just has that flourish to his work, but the cinematography in this just has this extra punch of energy. And it's Jan de Bont, uh, who is just, incredibly talented cinematographer. And, he may have directed a film or two after this. I don't know. Maybe maybe something about a bus or something, a tornado, a couple of movies like that. But anyway, and he's done.
No, the boat.
Oh yeah, that one with Willem Dafoe. Yeah, that one, and Jason Patrick. Woo!
And Jamie Gertz.
Yes, too, way too much. He's worked with uh, John McTiernan on Die Hard, Hunt for October. He's worked with Paul Verhoeven on Basic Instinct. Uh, he has a very distinctive style and it's vibrant, and it goes so well with Schumacher, I think. And it fits this movie and gives it kind of an edge that it needs because the story is really, calls for that. I really enjoy kind of the haunting that comes with this because yes, it's interesting that they go into the afterlife and they see these things that they've done in their past, but the fact that those things come back and haunt them kind of adds another layer of dread to this, but also they have to resolve these issues and they have to do that by confronting themselves. And I think that that's, a pretty honest and truthful thing in life. Not flatlining and facing these things, but when you confront your own issues and things that maybe you've done in your past, or maybe things that have resulted because of your actions, you kind of have to look within yourself and look to those that you may have affected and try to resolve it in, uh, in one way or another. That's where the hope in this movie comes in. And I think, there could be a little more depth to some of it, but I think there's also plenty of it that rings true. I really like Kevin Bacon in this movie. I like his character David, and I like Julia Roberts' character in this. I feel like hauntings in particular are really emotional, and the way that they're handled, the way that they're resolved, they're good. I think I like William Baldwin. I mean, the next year he's in Backdraft, which is just man, that's an awesome movie. I'd love to talk about that sometime. That is a fun movie. But I like his. I want to say that I completely misremembered his storyline because when we were talking about watching this, I said that he had the girl that he picked on. That was Kevin Bacon's character. He had all the women he slept with, and it had videos of, and all like women that he hurt, not physically, but that ends up being his comeuppance. That's terrible word for that, but I think his story's good too. There'd be a little bit more to it, but it's still a good story. It's a good resolution, that he ends up losing his, fiance. But there could be a little bit more to that. But again, and then Nelson is just a completely different ball of wax compared to them, and the stuff with him is really intense, and of course he doesn't tell anybody what's going on until it's getting way too serious. But I really enjoyed Kiefer in this. I think really he's really at home in kind of Schumacher's world. Like he fits so well into these films and just chews up the screen. And he's great in this too. And I also have to second Oliver Platt is definitely the fifth wheel in this. And I love Oliver Platt, but that's kind of that's his purpose in this, and he does very well at being. But hey, give me an extended cut where he flatlines too, and I'll give this an A+, maybe if it's good. But instead, I don't think that this is in the same ballpark as Lost Boys because it does have an atmosphere and it's a very cool atmosphere, but it doesn't have that same kind of elevation to it, and the story, while very good, also doesn't have the complete package emotionally that Lost Boys does. So ultimately, I think I kind of sit in an A- on this, which I think it's pretty good. I mean, that's a good rating. Just a little touch below what Schumacher can do, but boy, it's a fun movie and like fun in a thrilling way. I really like the vibe of this. I do want to mention that I got curious. I didn't get too curious enough to watch it, but I looked into the. I guess it's technically not even a remake. I guess it's a sequel, but not really. The that has it's got some good. It's got a decent cast. Diego Luna and
Ellen Page.
Nelson makes a return in that film, and it is Keith Sutherland. So I don't know if I'm gonna have to make myself watch it now. I really didn't want to. I don't. I don't.
I still don't want to.
I, I know. I don't really want to, but like the fact that Keither did it because he can kind of like he's interesting. Like sometimes he doesn't just do stuff to get work. Like he's a little more artistic in that, but sometimes he does. So it's it's just kind of trying to fiddle around and whether this is something he actually was cool with doing or if he just did it for the paycheck. I don't know if I'll ever make myself watch it or not, but I'm slightly more interested than I was. But I honestly don't know why they had to try to make another one, try to redo this because it's done pretty well to begin with. Um, I don't know what another one adds to it, but yeah, I'm gonna say A- for Flatliners.
I think that Flatliners has a lot of appeal to me. I have to also shout out again, like Kevin Bacon and Julia Roberts. I think both of them are really terrific in this movie. Like watching Joy Roberts, for instance, her character arc is really stark, where she's this hopeful person about what's on the other side, and then she confronts what's on the other side for her, and it really starts tearing her apart. But then she also has her own epiphany. Like that's the real
Right.
journey that she goes on. And I think Julia Roberts' performance helps sell so much of that. And Kevin Bacon is like this beating soul of the movie.
Right.
Like even as a skeptic at first, like he's still approaching everything from a real humanistic perspective. And watching that journey that he goes on is also kind of part and partial to defining how the movie deals with all of this drama and deals with the afterlife. I do think that even though I like their storylines, I do wish that there was even more development. Like Roger Ebert gave this 3 out of 4 stars, and one of his complaints was that he thought it was too repetitive in structure. Like we go through the same trauma over and over again, and here's another flatliner. We got to bring them back, and that part of it, I don't completely agree with that. Like I think it does kind of almost become more and more intense as it goes along. Like you expect one of these people might not come back, or what's going to happen to them. Like I feel like the movie's pretty intelligently designed in the sense of they feel like they're actually medical students.
Yeah.
It would have been easy for them to have skirted over some of those details a bit more, but it kind of feels lived in. It feels like they're really medical students, even though they're going into a really crazy territory, obviously pushing things very hard. Uh, I still think that there's something believable in the background of the movie. At the same time, I do wish, in a way, that the drama of it was brought out a little bit more. At the same time, I love when Kiefer just starts running towards the grave and then running away from his friends so that he can go kill himself to confront his own past. But, like the way that he just like blasts through it and runs is it's just really terrific image to me. Like just nobody's keeping up with him. He's just in his own playing field there. Kind of like gone crazy, but also he's already kind of accepted his own reality to a certain degree.
Right.
And at the same time he's seeking catharsis. Like he is hopeful for catharsis.
Yeah.
I just wish some of that was brought out even more, I guess. But the movie does have an effect to it. It definitely does have this flow to it that kind of brings you in. I've teetered on an A minus to a B plus for this movie because it's not perfectly what it ought to be, but the style of it just like
Right.
a lot of people talk about style over substance. You don't want style to exist over substance. And that's not really the argument being made by me that style ever does exactly supplant substance, but I do think that sometimes a movie can be experiential, and going on the ride with the movie, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily make up for a lack of substance, but it becomes its own thing in a way.
Right.
This movie is not perfect, but I feel like an A minus is fair because it's just so compelling to watch. It is gorgeously shot. It's obviously like this isn't necessarily on the pluses territory, but it's obviously a bigger budget than the Lost Boys, and it doesn't do everything with that budget that the Lost Boys does with its more limited scale.
Right.
But what it does do is fun stuff that you don't always see big stars doing either necessarily. I mean, you do and you don't here and there. Like the one of the reasons I don't want to see the new Flatliners, it does have some incredible talent involved in it at places, but it just looks, pardon the phrasing, flat. It doesn't look like it has the same. And maybe I'm wrong. It just doesn't look like it has the same richness that this movie does. But maybe I don't know if it was if I saw it just playing somewhere, existing on a streaming service when I when I'm looking for other horror viewings, maybe I'll have to give it a watch if I find myself compelled into it somehow.
Yeah.
Like, well, I'm looking for a horror movie and here's Flatliners, the new one. I just can't imagine it having the personality behind it that this one does. Like that personality is what makes the movie special in so many ways. And the cast is dynamite and they really have a lot of chemistry together too. Like I really enjoyed the dynamic. I feel like it's also obvious that Kiefer and Julia Roberts had a thing and almost got married.
Right.
And that's when Julia Roberts, one of the infamous ways that she became the runaway bride, is by running away from the engagement with Kiefer Sutherland. It's obvious that here on this set, like they have a thing for each other, like they have a real chemistry. And at times, like I'm thinking, like who's into each other? She's with Kevin Bacon, but it looks like she could be with Kiefer Sutherland. Anyway, I do think that they play well off of each other. The whole cast does, and yeah, I think A minus is a fair place to leave on Flatliners. But uh, randomly thinking about the running again brings me to the next movie, Blood Creek.
In the early 30s, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle became obsessed with the occult. Nazi agents traveled the globe in search of ancient Nordic relics known as runestones. The symbols inscribed in these stones were said to describe the path to immortality.
In 1936, a stranger came to Town Creek.
We were told you were a historian.
On a quest for an ancient stone.
They were here. Our ancestors. The Nordic gods.
That possessed the power of life.
Bring her here to me.
And death.
When you rule the blood, death is no longer the end.
What is that out there?
I was 12 when he came to our farm. He needed blood for the ritual, so he froze us in time like this.
He can't come into the house. There's a painting on the doors and the windows. Keep him out.
We had him contained until you came here. We're all going to pay for this now.
Just tell me how to kill him.
Once his third eye is released, he'll cross over. Nothing will be able to contain him, not even the runes.
Blood Creek
brings me to the next movie, Blood Creek, which jumps us forward 19 years after Flatliners, so much more significant jump than from Lost Boys to Flatliners. We jump forward to 2009 to a much smaller budget, to a much different period in Schumacher's career when he wasn't at the top of the directing heap. Like he had certainly still made movies here and there that made some mark, and I'm not even talking about just quality. I'm just talking about making a big step in the Hollywood system, as far as star meter is concerned, which is a different thing than quality. The last thing that he ever directed, though, were episodes of House of Cards, which are terrific. Like, this is a guy proving his talent by jumping into another production. Like his work in House of Cards was stellar, and it was great to see his name on the production list for a show like that. In the later stages of his career too, just to acknowledge that he was a terrific director and a talented director. The weird thing about Blood Creek is it's this small movie with big talent. Like that cast list is again, crazy. And in this sense, these are people that were about to break out. Michael Fassbender was about to break out. Henry Cavill was about to.
Right.
You have Dominique Purcell, Mr. Prison Break, and that show obviously had already been out. He's not maybe on the same star playing field, but probably the biggest star at that point that was in this movie. But you're just talking this interesting kind of level of star play, and definitely a talented cast.
Right.
Definitely a smaller movie. The reason, going back to I was mentioning running, just because Michael Fassbender, when he runs in this movie, it is so intense in a different way than Kiefer running in Flatliners. I just think it's an interesting theme. Like there's something that can be so immediate uh, when a character is running with the intensity that those characters are running.
Yes, definitely.
Like when Kiefer is running in Flatliners, it's this being several steps ahead of everybody else in terms of his own headspace, and everybody else not really knowing where he's at. When Fassbender's running, he's this incredible threat
Yeah.
that is otherworldly in so many ways. When he like jumps on and off of a horse, it can be really terrifying.
Right.
What I think one of the things there's so much to talk about really with Blood Creek. One of the things that I find interesting about it is Lost Boys wasn't a small movie, really exactly, but it was a smaller movie that was made really quickly. And Blood Creek is obviously a movie made small and quick.
Right.
But the difference is obviously Schumacher has this interest in sometimes going the sexy route. I mean, again, this is a fashion designer guy. This is a guy who is in Madonna's Vogue video as a photographer, before he was a film director. And he's clearly got that side of him too that enjoys the stylish side of things. But when you go to Blood Creek or look at other movies that he made, like 8 millimeter, really edgy, gritty, dark thriller.
Right.
8 millimeter is one of those movies that was probably a reason that he ended up making something like Blood Creek. Because the Hollywood system is like, you're kind of messed up in the head, bro. And of course, Nicolas Cage is Nicolas Cage, so he basically came out of that unscathed a little bit.
Right.
But Schumacher, in terms of what he wanted to bring to the table, like Schumacher wanted to make that kind of movie. He wanted to make stuff that was darker and grittier and didn't necessarily have the sleek, stylish side of things that we talked about in Lost Boys and Flatliners. Not that he disliked making that other stuff, right? But
Right.
I feel like there is this side of him that, and this happens sometimes with a number of people that are in the Hollywood system for long enough and in big enough a way, like somebody that maybe made a Batman film or two, and maybe heard a thing or two from studio executives, and they kind of maybe get burned out from studio notes and studio things, and they kind of sometimes find themselves wanting to just get down and dirty and kind of go into that part of themselves,
Right.
make a different kind of movie and make stuff outside of the system. And that's part of what Blood Creek is. And the other side of it is this case of how successful is it as a movie, regardless of intention or regardless of what's interesting or compelling behind it. And I've seen so many mixed opinions and thoughts about what Blood Creek is or isn't. And I know we talked very briefly before we recorded about what you thought of it a little bit, having seen it for the first time. I had seen it before, um, years ago, closer to when it came out, but when it was out on video, because it didn't have a big theatrical release. It was very limited in scope. Small, very under the radar movie that, was shot in Romania that just so happens to have these big people behind it. It's kind of weird how that happens sometimes. Set in West Virginia, but filmed entirely on location in Romania.
Right.
That's an interesting thing. Uh, yeah, but like, it's it's one of those movies that ultimately I feel like it's not quite what it should be. Like it could be a even better movie. It has so many really cool ideas and components, but it's not completely what it could be. Uh, the writer, David Kajganich, like I really don't know how to say his name, Kajganich. He wrote one of my favorite movies in recent years, Suspiria, a remake of Suspiria that came out just a couple years ago. I absolutely love and adore that movie. I think it's wonderful in so many ways. I feel like a Suspiria double feature, both Suspirias, would be theoretically a fun thing to do at some point. Maybe on another horror episode sometime in the future. But something interesting about Blood Creek, which at one point was known as Town Creek, is that the writer was not happy with Joel Schumacher because Schumacher rewrote and redid a lot of stuff in this movie, which also is reminiscent of Lost Boys in some ways, just because of Schumacher coming in with his own ideas. In this case, I have no idea what he changed it to. I don't know what it originally looked like. I'm sure it wasn't originally children. I'm sure it's not the same type of change that Lost Boys had. Like, oh, it's all kids. There was this occultist Nazi child who came to West Virginia. No, I'm sure it's not that version of the story. But whatever the changes were, I'm not sure what they were. But I I I do think that the Blood Creek that we have is this really interesting thing that Schumacher still brings a lot to. Like, there's so much in it that's still fascinating. I feel like the thing that's probably the worst about it, and I'm not usually the type of person that's bothered by this in the same way as others, not generally speaking, but some of the CGI looks cheap, and I feel like they could have gone with more of just the makeup effects because I really like a lot of the makeup effects. Fassbender looks utterly terrifying in this movie, and part of that is his physical presence and the intensity behind his eyes, but it's also the makeup and this idea of this Nazi occultist who's gathering power from this runestone. It's
Yes.
otherworldly thing happening that's also potentially incredibly dangerous with the uh, Nazi ideas behind it, right? Is he the story behind it being this guy that came to West Virginia in 1936, so before World War II had broken out, but as the Third Reich gaining steam, they're looking to gain power from these runestones. And meanwhile, these farmers decide to essentially capture this guy and hold him there, but they're also caught in time, and there's this loop of 70 years basically where they've been stuck in this time, uh, waging battle with the Nazi occultist. That's a really wild story tangent. I feel like some of that, and this is part of the criticism I have for it, is some of that is a little bit breezed past. You don't get a full chance to experience that in the story of this family.
Right.
A big measure of it is just kind of the full speed ahead nature of the immediate action, and it doesn't always give you a chance to appreciate the dramatic journey of these characters. You don't really get a full chance to even know the relationship between Henry Cavill and Dominique Purcell. That would help even more to
Yeah.
spend some time, not necessarily even with them, just with Cavill before his brother shows up and takes him onto this dark journey where he's unaware of exactly what he's stepping into until, oh yeah, by the way, this is really crazy circumstance I just pulled you into
Right.
with so many supernatural scary components to it. Like it's almost not enough to know why they got pulled onto this journey. That full speed ahead nature is probably the only thing that ultimately brings the movie down some. And at the same time, personally, I really enjoyed this movie a great deal in spite of its issues. Like seeing the really scary nature of like killing the horses and bringing them back into undead state to rush into the house and attack people. That's a really intense, scary notion. Just how quickly he kind of commandeers things. Uh, Nazi zombies, that's a thing. I do think that the performances all around help sell a lot of the movie, which again, like Schumacher tends to get good casts, and those good casts tend to give good performances. I can't really point to anybody that doesn't fit, that doesn't help bring something to the table. There are just these really fun, dark grace notes in this movie. It gets really gritty and gory in parts.
Yes.
It has that intensity that Schumacher is capable of, uh, amped up pretty far. Like I said, this is the almost waging war with the Hollywood system Schumacher, the guy who is entirely in his own headspace. We're just going to go all out, Schumacher, and not concerned with making a super pretty movie. He's okay with roping a guy's neck with barbed wire movie. Like
Right.
this is a different speed of thing. And before I turn over, I was just going to mention as well Cal El at the end and the potential of a weird series to come from this, or at least a weird sequel where Henry Cavill, again Cal El, brands himself and is ready to take down some Nazis.
Right.
That's one crazy promise at the end that's obviously unfulfilled. At least as of yet, I don't I don't think there's any chance of a sequel or anything happening. But who's to say that somebody wouldn't redo this thing at some point in a different spirit and really flesh out some of these ideas, so to speak. But it's hard to say you'd get somebody as good as Michael Fassbender
Yeah.
as a single threat. What do you have to say, Drew, about this late entry horror film from Schumacher?
You know, I think that there's a lot of similarities to this story, at least with the brothers, to a show that we both like, Supernatural.
Yeah, yeah.
And, Supernatural would have been pretty. It been out for a couple of years at that point, but where Dean Winchester goes and brings Sam along with him on this hunt, it just ends up being a 15 season long adventure from there, versus this film, uh, with these brothers. But it's kind of a similar vibe. What it doesn't have, like you said, is that kind of extra depth to where we kind of know the history of these brothers. You can tell if something's there. I like their chemistry together, but I wish there was a little bit more to it to kind of sell it a little bit more and to kind of tie them in to this plot. The Lost Boys begins and ends with the music. This one begins and ends with Fassbender. I mean, he's incredible in this, and like you said, the the makeup effects and just on him in particular, it's just such a terrifying and cool look. And like, I almost wish that this was a pilot to a TV show.
It feels like kind of.
Yeah, it does kind of have that vibe, like we see them going out and taking down these Nazis all over the place. Probably would never get one as well played as Fassbender, but it would be a cool concept. But I love the ideas at play here. This is kind of you know uh, almost not quite, but almost Lovecraftian type of story where we're playing with some real potential extra worldly supernatural kind of horrors and a Nazi being in play with that is particularly scary. The animals also being kind of zombified is terrifying. I really like the cast in this too. I think they sell it. I do think the movie does come off as cheap. I mean, it is, and it's the mostly the CG that kind of does it. And I'm like you. I'm not a detractor of CG usage, but when it doesn't look good, it doesn't look good. And in this case, I think maybe it was a budget issue, maybe it was a time issue, but I think a little more practical take on it would have helped this one quite a bit. I think what it lacks for in that department, and also in kind of the writing, is the just, or in that emotional depth of the writing that's kind of lacking. What it does have is just the immediate driven nature that you mentioned, and it is very intense and they're very full on boom, boom, boom. Here we go. It's a ride, and it doesn't let up until it's over. And I enjoy that about it. And I think in some ways, it's a weakness for some of those other points, but it's very confident in its story, and it's very confident in the way that it pushes it forward. And I think that kind of balances it out. I really do like it. I was kind of surprised, like not that I thought I was just going to hate it, but I thought I might kind of be a little underwhelmed or see you know kind of a mediocre movie. But I don't think that's what this is. I think there are some touches to it that in other hands definitely would be. But I think this is a unique horror film. I like, you know, this gritty side of Schumacher because I haven't seen 8 millimeter. I would like to see that at some point. The films I have seen of his, not too many of them go this route, and I kind of like seeing him tour with this. So I potentially like to see some of these darker Schumacher films because I definitely kind of, think of him in a more whimsical light with Lost Boys and things like that. Not that he's not capable of serious films, because I have seen Falling Down as one of my favorite movies of all time, and one of his best. But I enjoy kind of this side of him. And, again, Fassbender, like you said, was about to explode onto the scene. Particularly the same year he was in Inglorious Bastards. And for me, was the best part about that movie because I'm not very fond of it. I know you and I have similar feelings on that. But he was incredible in that movie, and that's how he got on my radar. And of course, he was just everywhere after that. Was in movies all over the place. Cavill would eventually become Superman, and now is also Geralt of Rivia, very talented actor. And Dominic Purcell is, I never watched Prison Break, but I did see him on The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow and CW shows.
He's terrific on those shows.
I do, yeah, I like him a lot. And kind of in a smaller role in this movie is an actor that I really enjoy, and that's Shea Wiggum.
Yeah.
I particularly love him from Boardwalk Empire. He plays Eli Thompson in that show. Uh, he's pretty good in this too, even for what little he's in it. I I like, but ultimately, like Fassbender is what I like the most in this, and he just that look that of his character. It's so menacing. It's so terrifying, and it's just like pitch perfect. And, when he's like hammering into his own skull, makeup, the gore coming out. I, it touched a nerve. It was a little slightly unsettling, and I really enjoyed that about it. It has an edge I didn't expect a Schumacher film to have. Having said that, I think that this one kind of lacks from a presentation standpoint, even though there's some stuff in it visually that's really cool, and I think Schumacher's pretty confident in that regard. Without the Hollywood system, it doesn't have certain things that maybe could have pushed it over the edge too. Um, and again, I think there's a little bit of emotional depth to this that, and some logistic things uh, about how and why he even has the powers to get these things done in the first place. But that it's so fast paced that none of that matters, and I think it kind of balances out. But I'm going to give it a solid B. I think this is a an interesting, somewhat scary. It's in a fun way. It's more of a cult horror action type thing. I think people that enjoy stuff like the Wolfenstein video games or Nazi zombies, because before this was right before like the evil Nazi boom of entertainment. The Wolfenstein stuff was in the '90s, but they brought the games back in the recently in this last generation of consoles, way after this movie came out. And then Nazi zombies on Call of Duty. It was the late, probably 2010, somewhere in there when they started doing that. And then, of course, there was another film that came out the same year, and I actually saw that, but somehow didn't see this. It was a Norwegian film called Dead Snow.
Yeah.
Different plot, but it's a lot of fun. I like both of these movies probably about the same. I think Blood Creek and Dead Snow would be a fun double feature for someone if they're listening to this. If you haven't seen either one and you like that kind of idea of occultist uh, Nazi zombies, just the concept of it, I would watch both of these movies back to back and have a fun night. Uh, but yeah, I think this one's solid. I kind of like this side of Schumacher, but I would have liked it to see have a little bit more going.
Yeah, honestly, I kind of slid in this one. Like usually, most movies exist on a teeter totter, as I put it, between two grades. Often for me, like where I'm trying to decide where a movie's going to settle, and this one's been between a B plus and a B, and I think I had to fall down on the lower end on a B, the same as you. Like I keep wanting to give the movie credit even more for the parts that I really love in it, There are just some details in it that are just super cool. You know, some just fun, viscerally exciting bits to it. Uh, like I said, the grittier Schumacher side of things is cool, but it doesn't have a complete vision to completely bring it home. Basically, there's and who knows what that original screenplay looked like as far as like why the screenwriter was upset with Schumacher. Maybe there was something more to it. Maybe it deserved to be changed up. I don't know. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's part of the problem is there was a script that Schumacher felt the need to change, but it didn't change enough. Because like he felt the need to change Lost Boys, but he also had a great screenwriter to help him change it.
Right.
And in this case, Schumacher himself is changing it. And maybe they just didn't have enough time to fully develop all these ideas to bring everything home. Because what's under there is really interesting, and I want to bring it up again. It almost feels like it could be a pilot, and the only reason it doesn't feel like it should be a pilot is because Fassbender is so awesome. You don't know where it would go without him.
Right.
But nonetheless, a solid B is not the worst place to be either. And I just wanted to. We already introed talking about Schumacher. I just wanted to briefly say that obviously we're watching these three not to synopsize his entire career. It's because these are the three movies that he made that were horror films, and it's October 2020. So we're watching his horror films. I definitely intend to talk about some of his other movies down the line because there's some interesting stuff in his filmography. Stuff that we haven't seen, maybe some not so great stuff, but there's plenty of great stuff that we haven't talked about at all. And yeah, he's a super compelling filmmaker. We lost uh, a really terrific filmmaker, somebody that I really think a lot of as a filmmaker. Rest in peace, Joel. But at the same time, I'm grateful to have had this triple feature to watch, to talk about in this episode. Drew, my friend, thank you.
Grateful to get this opportunity to watch Blood Creek for the first time and see that he still kept that going. And I saw the episodes he directed of House of Cards as well. The talent he's still had going, but to kind of see him do just another film in the late 2000s and it still be good despite some of his problems. I it made me appreciate him as as I often do, and any chance to watch The Lost Boys again is a welcome one, and it always brings a smile to my face. So I echo your sentiments. And rest in peace, Joel Schumacher.
Thank you, Drew, for being on this episode once again.
Pleasure as always.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time here on Movie Marathon Mood.